Do you know that feeling when your mind gets so loud that you can't even hear your own thoughts? When ideas run faster than your breath and your chest tightens because everything inside you seems to shout at the same time? It's strange how the greatest battles don't always come from the world around you. Sometimes they come from the noise you carry within. And maybe that's exactly where you are right now, fighting a war no one sees, but feeling every impact deep inside your chest. There are moments when the mind becomes its own storm, throwing memories, fears, and possibilities like waves that never stop breaking. You try to calm down, but the noise grows louder. You try to pray, but your thoughts interrupt. You try to trust, but your mind argues back. And in all that noise, you start to wonder if God is silent, or if you simply can't hear him anymore. But what if the silence you fear is not absence, but invitation? What if God is not competing with the noise, but waiting for you to lower its volume? Because he rarely speaks in the same tone as your thoughts. Your mind shouts, God whispers. Your mind demands answers, God offers presence. Your mind pushes you to act immediately, God guides you to breathe. And here's something almost no one admits. Sometimes the greatest enemy of your peace is not the situation, it's the interpretation. The mind turns shadows into threats, possibilities into dangers, silence into abandonment. It convinces you that everything is urgent, fragile, out of control. But God never leads through panic, he leads through peace, even when the path isn't clear, even when your heart is tired. Even when the noise inside you keeps getting louder, because just beneath the surface of your thoughts, there is another sound. A sound that doesn't force its way in. A sound that doesn't overpower your anxiety. A sound that waits until your soul finally exhales. It is the sound of a God who is never in a hurry, who never confuses, who never abandons you to your own mind. It is the sound of someone who still knows how to speak to the quiet places you forgot you had. And maybe, without noticing, you've been following the louder voice instead of the truer one. Your mind has been telling stories, but God has been telling the truth. Your mind has been predicting danger, but God has been preparing purpose. Your mind has been showing fear, but God has been forming peace. And all this time he has been whispering something you were never meant to lose. So before we go any further, allow your breathing to slow down. Let the noise lower just enough for your soul to listen again. Because there is a whisper waiting inside the stillness, a whisper that leads you back to safety, back to clarity, back to the presence you thought you had lost. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. Psalm 4:8. And this is where everything begins. Sometimes the loudest noise in your life doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. It's the kind of noise no one notices, but it drains you completely. Racing thoughts that seem to have a life of their own. Emotions that show up without warning. Worries that echo inside an empty room. And the more you try to silence them, the stronger they feel. The soul tries to speak, but the mind doesn't give it space. The problem is that the mind always speaks loudly, but it rarely speaks truth. It fires warnings, creates scenarios, revives old wounds as if they were happening right now. And in all that internal chaos, you begin to believe that this storm defines you, but it doesn't. The noise inside may be intense, but it's not permanent. It describes your moment, not your destiny. The soul knows this, but the mind shouts louder. And that's where Psalm 4:8 becomes more than a verse. It becomes a direct confrontation with your agitation. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. This declaration wasn't born from a life without noise, but from someone who learned that true peace doesn't come from controlling the mind, but from resting in God. Peace is not produced by you, it is given by Him. When you observe your own mind, you realize it can create storms, but it can never produce rest. That rest comes from another place, from that gentle presence that doesn't compete with the noise. It simply waits until you realize you're not fighting alone. The soul can recognize that presence even when the mind insists on being restless. The Bible shows repeatedly that God speaks in environments that feel too quiet for us, but perfect for Him. Samuel heard God while everything around him slept. Moses heard God in the desert, where nothing distracted him. Elijah heard God not in the strong wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the whisper. They all had one thing in common. When the mind grew still, the divine voice became clear. And this is the spiritual key almost no one notices. Inner noise doesn't stop God from speaking. It stops you from perceiving Him. God doesn't raise His voice to compete with your anxiety. He keeps the tone of a whisper because the goal is not to force you to listen, but to teach you to discern. The training is not in the volume of God's voice, but in the sensitivity of your heart. So maybe the first step isn't trying to silence the mind, but recognizing that the soul can still hear. And as you start to notice that difference between what shouts and what guides, something begins to shift inside you. Because once you start recognizing the silence of the soul, you naturally begin to seek the one who speaks within it. And it's exactly here that the next step begins to open. It's impressive how the mind can turn small concerns into major threats. Sometimes nothing has changed on the outside, but inside everything feels worse within minutes. The mind projects scenarios that never existed, invents tragic endings for stories that haven't even started, and creates confusion even when God is trying to lead you with calm. And when that happens, it's easy to trust the imagination of the mind more than the truth God actually spoke. The verse in 1 Corinthians 14:33 exposes this difference clearly. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. This means that every time your thoughts become chaotic, urgent, desperate, they already reveal their source. They are not from God. Confusion is always tied to anxiety, never to the spirit. Peace is always tied to direction, never to panic. God guides, fear pressures. And here is the hardest part to admit. Many of the battles you fight have nothing to do with what is happening, but with what you imagine could happen. The mind creates distorted versions of the future, shaped by old memories, unresolved wounds, and narratives you absorbed without noticing. It's as if the mind writes entire scripts without consulting God. And you, unintentionally, start living as if those scripts were true. The Bible shows several people who fell into the trap of internal narratives. Gideon believed he was too weak. Moses believed he couldn't speak. Elijah believed he was completely alone. None of these certainties were real. They were emotional interpretations that felt real. God had to intervene to show that the spiritual truth was completely different from the story their minds were telling them. And this also happens to you. When fear creates scenarios, the soul loses clarity. When anxiety takes over, perception becomes distorted. But when you begin filtering your thoughts through truth, through the voice that does not confuse, something shifts. It's like a light slowly entering the room, revealing that many things that felt urgent or frightening were only shadows, not substance. The difference between overthinking and hearing God is simple, yet profound. Overthinking creates weight. Hearing God creates direction. Overthinking traps you in fear. Hearing God leads you into trust. Overthinking breeds confusion. Hearing God restores peace. And when this perception finally begins to grow inside you, something loosens. The mind loses part of its control. The soul breathes deeper, and truth begins to take up space, even if slowly. And it's exactly at this point that an inevitable question rises within you. If the mind can fabricate so many scenarios, how do I recognize when God is truly speaking? This question doesn't bring pressure. It brings invitation. It's as if, in the midst of the noise, a small opening appears. A space where the soul begins to perceive that there is another voice, softer, steadier, truer than all the others. A voice that doesn't compete with fear, but disarms it. A voice that doesn't come from the mind, but from the spirit. And when this awareness begins to form, you finally approach something that has always been present, just hidden behind the noise. There is a spiritual truth almost every Christian knows, but very few actually experience. God does not compete with noise. He doesn't force his way through your anxiety, doesn't push himself between your racing thoughts, doesn't invade you with sounds louder than your own. The voice of God does not fight for volume. It reveals itself when the heart slows down. That's why so many people believe God is silent, when in reality, it's the inner noise that's speaking louder. Elijah's encounter in 1 Kings 19:12 reveals this with unsettling clarity. And after the fire came a still, small voice. God was not in the strong wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. He was in the whisper, the most unlikely sound for someone who was running, exhausted, and emotionally drained. It was as if God was saying, "I won't shout for you to hear me, but when you stop, I speak." This pattern repeats in our lives. We want God to speak with urgency, but he speaks with depth. We want a sign that shakes everything around us, but he sends a gentle impression within us. The mind demands immediate clarity. God offers silent direction. And it's in this difference that many people get lost, because we've learned to listen to what is loud, not to what is true. When you begin to quiet the noise, even for a few seconds, you realize there is a spiritual sensitivity that never disappeared. It was only buried under layers of thoughts and emotions. And when that sensitivity awakens, you realize that what felt like God's absence was really just a lack of space within you. Scripture shows other moments where God spoke softly. Samuel heard God while everything around him slept. Mary received the most impossible message while no one was paying attention to her. Joseph received direction through dreams, quietly, without chaos, without spectacle. God does not choose the loudest hour, he chooses the most honest one, the moment when you are finally vulnerable enough to receive what he wanted to say long ago. And when you begin to notice this pattern, something within you realigns. Suddenly the priority is no longer having all the answers, but creating space to perceive them. Anxiety loses strength, fear loses influence, and the heart begins to understand that God is not distant. He simply speaks in a way the noise of the mind cannot interpret. This is why lowering the inner volume is not an emotional technique. It is a spiritual act. And as this understanding matures, a new expectation begins to rise inside you, quiet but very real. The awareness that if you keep lowering the noise, what God is whispering will finally be heard with clarity. And it's in this very state of openness that the next layer of this journey begins to unfold. It's uncomfortable to admit, but necessary if you want peace. The mind lies. It creates stories that sound convincing, but aren't true. It mixes old memories with present pain, builds interpretations based on fear, and turns small shadows into giant threats. The mind sounds believable because it speaks with familiarity, but it does not speak with accuracy. And many times you suffer because of versions of events that never happened. When Jesus prays in John 17:17, he reveals something profound. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. Truth is not born from emotion. Truth is born from God. Truth doesn't change with mood, anxiety, or circumstance. It is fixed, solid, immovable. That is why Jesus prays for us to be sanctified, separated, and protected by the truth. He knows the human mind can build invisible prisons, and the only key that unlocks them is spiritual truth. The mind creates confusion, God creates clarity. The mind generates urgency, God generates direction. The mind distorts, God aligns. And when you begin to see this, you discover something essential. Not every thought deserves your trust. Not every emotion deserves your attention. Not every interpretation deserves to be followed. The mind speaks loudly, but God speaks correctly. Volume doesn't determine origin, peace does. Scripture shows this clearly in the life of Jeremiah. He believed God had completely abandoned him. His emotions were so intense that he wrote, "My strength is gone, and so is my hope in the Lord." But soon after, when he remembered the truth, Jeremiah declared, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed." His mind lied. God didn't. Spiritual truth dismantled the emotional narrative. And this still happens to you today. How many times did you think you were alone? And you weren't. How many times did you think there was no way out, and God opened a door? How many times did you think you couldn't make it, and He sustained you? The mind creates stories based on fear, but God writes stories based on faithfulness. God's truth is always greater than the mind's interpretation. When you choose to filter your thoughts through truth, not through fear, something shifts. Anxiety loses its arguments. Doubt loses its strength. The soul breathes again, and you begin to realize that much of your emotional pain didn't come from what actually happened, but from the story the mind built around it. Truth doesn't destroy the mind, it puts it in its proper place. And as you open yourself to this reality, a new awareness grows within you. If the mind can lie, then I need to learn to listen to the one who never lies. And this desire, even if small, is already a powerful spiritual movement, because it creates space to discern the voice that truly transforms. If this is speaking to you right now, stay with us. One of the greatest tensions in spiritual life is realizing that God doesn't always speak in ways that make sense to the mind. Logic seeks safety, predictability, explanations. But God works on a different frequency, a frequency not based on what you see, but on what He is forming within you. And when those two worlds collide, the mind tries to resist what the Spirit is trying to reveal. Proverbs 3:5 presents this in a direct and unsettling way. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. This doesn't mean abandoning reason. It means recognizing that reason alone is not enough to interpret everything God is doing. Logic sees the moment. God sees the whole. Logic calculates possibilities. God writes purposes. Logic depends on predictions. God depends on promises. When we look at Scripture, we see that God often led His children through paths that made no sense at first. Noah built an ark when it wasn't even raining. Abraham was called to a land he didn't know. Joseph was taken to Egypt through circumstances that looked unfair, but were aligned with a greater purpose. In every one of these cases, human logic would have rejected the path, but God's direction was precisely there. And this still happens today. Many times God responds in ways the mind never expected. He closes doors you wanted to open and opens doors you hadn't considered. He moves you out of places that felt safe into places that feel uncertain, because what He wants to form in you is greater than what you were trying to preserve. The mind seeks explanations. God offers transformation. Logic always asks why, but God almost always answers with what for. Why looks to the past, what for looks to the future. Why tries to justify, what for tries to guide. And when you begin to understand this difference, you realize that faith is not an escape from reasoning, it's an invitation to go beyond it. Faith illuminates what logic cannot explain. When you choose to trust even without understanding, something deep begins to happen within you. The heart strengthens, anxiety loses ground. The mind, once restless, starts to accept that not everything must be understood before it is lived. Because faith doesn't depend on full clarity, it depends on continuous trust. And that trust opens space to perceive movements of God that logic could never detect. And it is in this very space, between what you don't understand and what God is preparing, that a new sensitivity is born. A perception that does not demand immediate answers, but learns to walk with the one who sees beyond. And as that trust grows, Something deeper begins to unfold within the silence. There is a kind of silence that frightens, but there is another that heals. A silence that feels like abandonment, and another that is actually deep treatment of the soul. When God allows seasons of silence, He is not removing His presence, He is removing the distractions. He is not withholding answers, He is realigning perception. The silence of God is not emptiness, it is spiritual surgery. Isaiah 30:15 reveals this mystery in a stunning way. In repentance and rest is your salvation, in quietness and trust is your strength. God links salvation to stillness, strength to tranquility, and trust to something that does not depend on noise. This shows that healing often does not happen when you speak more to God, but when you finally allow Him to speak to you. The mind believes silence is dangerous. It wants immediate answers, signs, confirmation. But God works in a different rhythm. He uses stillness to reveal what noise hides. It is in silence that you notice wounds that were muffled, internal lies that felt like truth, fears you were carrying without realizing it. Silence doesn't expose you to God, it exposes you to yourself. Scripture shows this clearly in the story of Jonah. In the silence of the fish's belly, he perceived truths he had ignored during the entire journey. It wasn't the noise of the storm that transformed him, it was the silence of isolation. It was there, without distractions, that God corrected his vision, aligned his mission, and restored his obedience. Sometimes God needs to take you to a silent place to show you what the noise would never let you see. In many moments, the silence of God is a mirror. It reveals where you have been leaning more on emotion than on truth, more on anxiety than on faith. It shows where your interpretations were distorted, where your expectations were misaligned, where your soul was more tired than you were willing to admit. Silence doesn't hurt, it cleanses. Silence doesn't punish, it prepares. And when you learn to position yourself inside that silence, something extraordinary happens. The mind that once reacted with despair begins to recognize that the apparent emptiness is filled with presence, that the pause has purpose, that the lack of immediate answers contains instruction. It's like discovering that silence doesn't disconnect you from God, it disconnects you from everything that was keeping you from hearing Him. And it's precisely in this environment, where the noise fades and the soul begins to breathe, that something new opens inside you. A more mature sensitivity, a deeper listening, a gentler understanding of what God is truly forming. And as that listening awakens, the next spiritual step begins to take shape within your own stillness. Thinking can be a tool, but overthinking is a prison. There are moments when the mind works so hard, so exhaustively, that it stops being useful and becomes destructive. You try to solve, anticipate, predict, control, and the more you try, the more exhausted you become. There is a point where continuing to think doesn't produce clarity, only weariness. And it's at that point that faith invites you to another path. Stopping is not giving up, it's trusting. Psalm 46:10 declares, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." This is not a command to be passive, but to adjust your internal posture. God is not saying, "Stop acting," but "Stop fighting alone." Stillness is not the absence of movement, it is guided movement. It is the conscious decision to interrupt the cycle of anxiety so that God can be God within you. The mind interprets stillness as weakness. It tells you that if you stop, everything will fall apart. It insists that you must think more, search more, try more. But biblical stillness goes in the opposite direction. It teaches that when you stop, heaven works. When you silence inner arguments, God has space to guide you. When you release control, He holds you. The internal battle is not won with more effort, but with more surrender. A clear example of this is the crossing of the Red Sea. While the people panicked, trying to predict the worst, God said to Moses, "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." The people wanted to fight, shout, despair. God asked for stillness, not because the problem was small, but because the intervention would be divine. Stillness opened space for the impossible. And this happens today in quieter ways. You try to control a situation, predict outcomes, solve everything through sheer mental effort, and nothing changes. The mind demands immediate action, but God asks for trust. Because some answers don't arise from mental effort, they arise from spiritual surrender. Think less as avoidance, think less as faith. When you finally allow your heart to stop, even for a moment, something inside you reorganizes. Your breathing shifts, the mind slows down, fear loses its arguments. Stillness brings a clarity that noise made impossible. And slowly you realize it was never a lack of strength. It was too much struggle. It wasn't a lack of faith, it was too much control. And it's exactly at this point, when the soul finds this kind of stillness, firm, alive, full of trust, that a new understanding begins to emerge. The realization that calm is not the absence of movement, but the presence of God. And that presence, when it surrounds you, prepares your heart to see beyond reasons and step into a deeper level of purpose. The mind always wants immediate answers. It keeps asking why over and over. Why did this happen? Why did it take so long? Why didn't it work? Why me? It's a natural impulse. The mind tries to assemble the pieces, explain the process, find logic in everything. But God doesn't work according to the logic of the mind. He works according to the logic of purpose. And purpose is rarely understood at the beginning. Psalm 92:5 reveals this deeply. How great are your works, Lord, how profound your thoughts. God's thoughts are not shallow, not obvious, not immediate. They are deep, and depth requires time, silence, and maturity to be understood. The mind wants quick answers. God builds lasting meaning. The mind wants shortcuts. God works in roots. When we look at biblical stories, this becomes clear. Joseph spent years not understanding why he was suffering. David was anointed king, but lived as a fugitive. Paul was taken into the Arabian desert before beginning his ministry. In all these cases, the mind would have said everything was wrong. But when God's timing was fulfilled, everything made sense. Why became for what. And this also happens to you. Many times, what looks like chaos is alignment. What looks like delay is preparation. What looks like silence is teaching. But the mind, limited to the present moment, cannot see what God already sees completely. That's why anxiety grows. The mind interprets the lack of explanation as a lack of direction. But God doesn't stop directing just because you don't understand. When you begin to accept that not everything needs to make sense right now, something shifts inside you. The soul becomes lighter. The heart becomes more receptive. Trust begins to grow. Because faith is not built on explanations, it's built on relationship. God doesn't want you to understand everything. He wants you to walk with Him while everything comes together. The mind seeks reasons to feel safe. God offers meaning so you can become mature. Reason controls, meaning transforms. Reason looks at circumstances, meaning looks at purpose. When you trade the need for understanding for the willingness to trust, the weight lifts. Not because everything becomes clear, but because you finally stop fighting what isn't ready yet. And it's exactly in that moment, when you release the need for immediate answers, that something opens spiritually within you. A new sensitivity, a new breath, a new awareness of what God is working on in silence. And that awareness leads you to a place where peace begins to grow even before the answer arrives. Share one word in the comments that describes this moment for you. Peace never arrives all at once. It comes like someone who approaches slowly, waiting to be welcomed, and most of the time it doesn't enter while the mind is still at war. Peace doesn't compete with noise, It waits for the moment when the noise loses its authority. And that moment usually comes when you finally realize that your thoughts are not sovereign. Peace isn't born from explanations. It's born from surrender. Isaiah 26:3 describes this with deep precision. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. Peace is not the result of a perfect day or an orderly mind. It is the result of trust. Those whose minds are steadfast refers to someone who, even tired, chooses to place their heart in the right place. And when the heart positions itself, the mind starts to grow quiet. The mind creates storms that feel real, strong waves, opposing winds, internal pressures. But the peace of God works like a silent anchor. It doesn't stop the wind from blowing, but it keeps the boat from capsizing. It doesn't remove the movement of the water, but it prevents you from being overwhelmed by it. Peace does not remove external noise. It disables internal noise. The Bible shows this in the lives of the disciples in the boat. The storm was real, but the panic came from their minds, not from the wind. While they were desperate, Jesus was sleeping, not because he ignored the danger, but because he carried a peace that didn't depend on circumstances. When he rose and calmed the sea, it became clear that the most dangerous storm wasn't outside, it was inside them. And that is the storm God has been working on within you. When you begin to see your thoughts not as facts, but as possibilities, something shifts. Anxiety loses credibility. Fear loses autonomy. Noise loses its dominion. And gradually, like someone walking through a heavy curtain, you realize there is an internal place where peace has always existed, just overshadowed by the volume of the mind. This peace is not trying to convince you that everything will work out immediately. It is reminding you that God is with you immediately, and that presence, when recognized, changes everything. The heart calms, the breathing shifts. The soul finds rhythm, and little by little the noise that once shouted becomes weaker, more distant, less defining. And it's exactly at this point, when peace begins to appear not as a temporary feeling but as a constant presence, that you finally become able to notice something the noise always tried to hide. God was already guiding you. All that was missing was space. And now, with a quieter soul, you are about to see how his whisper becomes direction. One of the most striking characteristics of God's voice is that it doesn't need to be loud to be clear. It doesn't need to be forceful to be firm. It doesn't need to sound extraordinary to be transformative. Many times, it arrives as a gentle impression, a conviction that forms without effort, a stillness that guides more than any internal shouting could. It is a whisper, but a whisper that carries authority. Jesus makes this explicit in John 10:27. My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. He doesn't say his sheep notice a thunderous sound. He says they hear his voice. This means recognizing God does not depend on volume. It depends on relationship. Those who walk with him learn to identify the tone of heaven, even in the chaos of the mind. The mind seeks grand signs. It wants immediate certainty, visible confirmation, concrete proof. But God works much more intimately. He speaks within the conscience, through convictions you cannot explain, through quiet directions that make sense only later. He doesn't manipulate your emotions, he guides your soul. And this guidance always comes with peace, even when it challenges logic. Many biblical figures were guided this way. Joseph received dreams that revealed direction. Samuel heard God while the world slept. Philip was led by the Spirit to approach someone he didn't even know needed help. None of this came with noise, it came with clarity, because the voice of God does not depend on spectacle, it depends on intimacy. And when you begin to recognize this pattern, you realize that God has been speaking to you far longer than you noticed. Those directions born in calm, those inner nudges calling you somewhere else, those quiet convictions you felt without being able to explain, none of that was just in your head. It was God guiding you with his favorite language, the whisper. The whisper of God does not shout, but it confronts. It does not pressure, but it directs. It does not confuse, but it brings serenity. It does not push you, it calls you. And when you learn to follow that voice, even without seeing the whole picture, you realize it always leads you to places of life, growth, and transformation. The whisper is gentle, but it is never weak. And it is precisely at this point, when you begin to recognize the voice that remains in the midst of silence, that the whole journey starts to make sense. Because now, with the noise quieter, with the heart more attentive, and with the soul more open, you are finally ready to hear what God has been trying to say from the beginning. Now that you've walked through this journey, you may finally see something that was hidden beneath all the noise. God was never silent. You were simply surrounded by your own thoughts to the point you couldn't perceive him. All those internal pressures, the stories your mind told you, the scenarios that never actually happened, none of that had anything to do with God's voice. Because God does not speak through fear, urgency, or confusion. He speaks through peace. And when you begin to lower the volume inside you, even a whisper becomes enough to change everything. Because what transforms you is not the force of the voice, it's the source of it. And God always speaks from a place where chaos doesn't exist. He speaks from eternity. He speaks from truth. He speaks from the deep love he has for you. And that voice, even when it comes softly, never comes weak. Maybe this video revealed areas of your life where your thoughts have been in control. Maybe it showed you where you've trusted more in the interpretations of your mind than in the direction of the Spirit. Maybe it exposed how tired you've become from carrying your own conclusions. But here's the good news. You don't have to keep living guided by the noise. There is a truer voice waiting to be heard within you. So let me ask you, which part of your life needs silence today so God can speak again? And another, which thought do you need to release so you can finally hear what he has been whispering? These questions don't require speed. They require sincerity. God works with honesty, not perfection. Now take a deep breath and imagine something simple yet real. The hand of Christ resting gently on your head, calming an inner storm you can no longer control on your own. Imagine his soft light touching exactly the place where your mind always tightens. It doesn't take a loud moment for that to happen. A whisper is enough. And this whisper doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within, where he has always been. If this message spoke to you, keep walking with us. And if you'd like to support this spiritual work, subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. The peace you're searching for is not a mental state, it is a person. It is Christ, and he is here.